So by the end of the 1970 season, a lot of Montreal Canadiens fans exactly what's going on here. Now, the NHL had expanded at the end of the 1967 season. They put all the original six teams in the same division, while the six new franchises were in the what was called unofficially the Western Conference. Montreal had won the cup against St. Louis in sweeps in 68 and 69. A lot of people felt, hey, this is might going to continue in 1970 because most of the top players, including Henri Richard, Jean Beliveau, John Ferguson, Yvon Cornway, were still with the team. A young defense, veteran players like Lapierre, J.C. Tremblay, a few others were given Montreal consistent scoring. Now, at one point in the regular season, Montreal was well in position for a playoff spot. They by mid-February they were uh, just two games out of first place, and with solid goaltending, everything seemed to be okay. But sometimes in the NHL, and this happens with the best of teams, you went through a little bit of doldrums, and the doldrums lasted about 3 weeks between mid-February and early March, and he lost seven key games out of 10. When I'm saying key games, they were playing the majority of their games against their own conference or division, and Montreal true balance play was not there because you wanted to keep the expansion team strong. Now, it ended up in the regular season that Montreal had to win one game against Chicago on the final weekend, and the Rangers had to beat Detroit by several goals to clinch the playoff spot, and unfortunately, that's what happened. The Rangers, who kind of faded midway through the season and fell out of first place to fourth, he scored a ton of goals against a weakened Detroit team on that last weekend. Montreal had a back-to-back against Chicago, and they were trailing 5-2 in the final game in Chicago, and they had to score, I think it was 6 goals to make the playoffs in the plus minus. But unfortunately, they couldn't do it. They pulled their goalie, Claude Well, who was had no should not have been the head coach of the Montreal Canadiens in any shape or form. Eventually pulled a goalie. Chicago scored 5 goals, and Montreal went down to a humiliating defeat. What was doubly ironic for that season is that Montreal had more points than the number one team in the other conference. If there was an 8-team direct format, obviously they would have made the playoffs as the number five seed because and what was really terrible is when the first time in almost 40 years, Montreal didn't make the playoffs, and because Toronto had quite a weak team that year, there was no Canadian teams in the playoffs for the first time, as many can remember, going back, like I said, decades. It was a terrible year for the NHL fans in Canada of the Habs and Leafs that year. Toronto was really on the downward trend since the '67 Cup. Montreal, even though they played well in the first half of the season and towards the end, he never played pretty well a full season, and he paid for it by not making the playoffs. But again, the playoff format was a little bit different, and in the following years, the format changed when Buffalo and Vancouver came in, Islanders and Atlanta. 16-team league, and later an 18, then 17, and with the WHA 21, it was a much better format. But it's kind of bizarre too. There was a format at one point where 16 teams made the playoffs at one point out of the 21. So the NHL has never had a positive playoff format, especially against the for the Canadian teams. And Clarence Campbell did a really shitty job in promoting or unpromoting the fact that you needed Montreal, Toronto in the playoffs. You should have had a format would almost guarantee one of the teams would get in. But again, Boston was strong that year. They won the cup. Chicago was a little bit improved because Esposito was really finding his own between the net. Bobby Hull was still a strong force. Dennis was coming on. The young players in Chicago were starting to shine. Detroit still had Delvecchio and some of the veteran players, again, like Gordie Howe. But again, there's not much YouTubes about the 1970 season because, Canadian hockey fans don't want to really think of that year. But when Montreal didn't make the playoffs due to bad play a quarter century later, it wasn't as much of a hit. That 1970 season, it still leaves a bad taste for the journals who covered it, for the fans that watch it, for the advertisers, because the advertisers like Esso and the beer companies needed the Canadian teams in the playoffs to sell their wares, and no Canadian teams. The ratings were the shit in that playoff year. According to statistics, that were provided by CBC, viewership was down 25%, especially for the first round, because as a lot of people know, the first round has more viewers. It was pretty hard to sell the final two despite Bobby Orr against St. Louis, because everyone knew that the NHL or the original six division was going to win the cup no matter what's going to happen. So it wasn't really parity yet. So it's COVID Monday. We're still waiting for better weather to come. We had a massive cloudburst and thunder overnight in the Woodstock region. So be careful. Careful on the roads. Might be a little snowstorm coming in later on this week. So again, be careful. If you like this podcast, you leave a comment, subscribe, or a like. And if you like it, tell your friends. And if you don't like it, don't tell nobody. Have a good day. Bye.